Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 1 of our complete practice question series for the AZ-305 Microsoft Certified Solutions Architect Expert exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends. Then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 1. Now consider question number 1. This one tests your understanding of unstructured storage. Scenario: a digital publishing company is moving a media catalog to Azure. Media files are at most 48 megabytes, must be encrypted at rest, and will be delivered through Azure Front Door with WAF. Customer profiles must scale automatically, remain available after a regional data center failure, and support active writes from 2 Azure regions. Drag each data category to the Azure service that best satisfies its requirements. The source items are as follows. Source 1, media catalog files. Source 2, customer profile records. Now review the available destinations. Destination option A, Azure Blob Storage. Destination option B, Azure Cosmos DB. Destination option C, Azure SQL Database. Destination option D, Azure Table Storage. For mapping 1, pair media catalog files with Azure Blob Storage. For mapping 2, pair customer profile records with Azure Cosmos DB. Here is the technical justification. Blob storage is optimized for encrypted object data and can be used as an Azure Front Door origin. Cosmos DB supports elastic throughput, global distribution, and active multi-region writes for profile data. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use blob storage for large unstructured objects, and Cosmos DB when globally distributed operational data requires elastic scale and active multi-region writes. We will now analyze question number 2. Consider the following scenario. A queue-triggered Azure Functions workload currently runs on a consumption plan. The workload will be containerized and moved to a standard AKS cluster that may use either Kubernetes or Azure CNI. Which 2 scaling components should you enable so that pods scale from queue depth and the cluster can add nodes when pods cannot be scheduled? Select 2. Identify all valid responses. Now examine the possible answers. Choice A. Enable the virtual node add-on. Choice B. Enable the AKS cluster autoscaler. Choice C. Configure only the horizontal pod autoscaler. Choice D. Enable the Kata add-on. Choice E. Install virtual kubelet manually. Select option B. Enable the AKS cluster autoscaler, and option D. Enable the Kata add-on. The reasoning is as follows. Kata provides event-driven pod scaling from Azure Queue Storage, matching the function's event-based scaling model. The cluster autoscaler adds or removes AKS nodes as pod capacity requirements change. A. Virtual nodes burst to Azure container instances and are not the required cross-network plugin scaling mechanism. C. HPA is primarily metric-based and does not by itself reproduce queue-triggered event scaling or add nodes. E. Manual virtual kubelet installation is unnecessary and does not provide the complete scaling design. Keep this examination point in mind. Use Kata for event-driven pod scale and the cluster autoscaler for node scale. Question number 3. We are moving to Azure SQL design. Review the situation. A billing platform requires a single Azure SQL database in the DTU purchasing model. Committed transactions must survive a compute failure without data loss, and the database must remain available if one availability zone fails. Which listed deployment tier is the lowest tier that provides synchronous high availability replicas and supports zone redundancy for this design? The options are: Choice A, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Choice B, Azure SQL Database Standard. Choice C, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. Choice D, Azure SQL Database Premium. The appropriate choice is option D, Azure SQL Database Premium. The requirement is satisfied because Premium uses multiple synchronous replicas and supports zone-redundant placement, satisfying zero data loss, local failover, and zonal resilience within the stated DTU design. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Hyperscale is designed for very large and rapidly growing databases and is not the lowest cost listed fit. B. Standard does not provide the intended premium high availability architecture natively. C. Managed instance changes the deployment model and is not an Azure SQL database DTU tier. Exam tip. 4 DTU-based Azure SQL database questions. Premium is the high-performance tier associated with multiple synchronous replicas and zone redundancy. Proceed to question number 4. A global commerce platform needs a distributed relational database. Developers must use PostgreSQL-compatible SQL, maintain relational tables, and deploy replicas in additional Azure regions for resilience. Which Azure Cosmos DB API or deployment model should the architect recommend? Review the options. Option A. Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra. Option B. Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. Option C. Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Option D. Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. In this case, select Option D, Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL provides a distributed relational PostgreSQL engine, supports SQL and relational schemas, and offers resilience features such as high availability and cross-region recovery options. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Cassandra is a wide-column NoSQL model and does not provide PostgreSQL relational semantics. B. MongoDB is document-oriented rather than relational PostgreSQL. C. The NoSQL API uses a document model, and its SQL-like query language is not a relational PostgreSQL database. A requirement for relational storage and PostgreSQL SQL points to Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL, not a document or wide-column API. The next item is question number 5. Consider this scenario. A document processing solution has independent order, invoicing, inventory, and dispatch components. Each component must exchange XML work items asynchronously through a simple, durable Azure queue that does not require advanced routing or pub sub features. Which service should be included in the design? Available choices. Choice A, Azure Application Gateway. Choice B, Azure Queue Storage. Choice C, Azure Notification Hubs. Choice D, Azure Blob Storage. The correct answer is option B, Azure Queue Storage. This is correct because Azure Queue Storage provides simple, durable asynchronous message queues that decouple distributed application components without the overhead of advanced pub sub features. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Application Gateway is a Layer 7 web traffic load balancer, not a message queue. C. Notification Hub sends push notifications to mobile devices and is not a workflow queue. D. Blob Storage stores objects, but does not provide queue consumption semantics. A useful examination rule is this. Choose Azure Queue Storage over Service Bus when you only need simple point-to-point queues without advanced brokering features like topics or message ordering. Proceed to question number 6. Scenario. A telemetry platform sends events to Azure Event Hubs. The architect will use native Event Hubs capture for a cold path and will not add a stream analytics transformation job. Complete the design statements. Statement 1. The capture destination should be the blank. Select from 1. Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2, Premium Blob Storage, or Premium Azure Files. Statement 2. The reporting system must natively parse the blank files. Select from 2. Apache Parquet, Avro, or JSON. The answer to the first statement is Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. Event Hubs Capture supports Azure Storage and ADLS Generation 2 destinations. ADLS Generation 2 is the listed analytics-oriented destination. The answer to the second statement is Avro. Native Event Hubs Capture writes captured events in Avro format when no additional transformation service is used. The key takeaway is separate native Event Hubs capture from Stream Analytics no-code capture patterns that can produce other analytical formats. Review question number 7. Carefully. This question moves us into disaster recovery. Let us first review the situation. A managed MySQL flexible server runs in one Azure region. The business requires a warm copy in another region and wants the shortest practical recovery time after a regional outage. Which design should be recommended? Compare the following options. Option A is configure geo-redundant backup only. Option B is create a cross-region read replica. Option C is place database files on premium Azure files. Option D is configure self-managed MySQL replication on virtual machines. The best answer is option B, create a cross-region read replica. The key reason is a cross-region read replica maintains a continuously replicated server that can be promoted during a regional outage, generally reducing recovery time compared with restoring geo-redundant backups. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A, geo-restore requires creation and restoration of a new server and typically has higher RTO and RPO. C, flexible server storage is managed by the service and cannot be moved to Azure files. D, self-managed replication adds unnecessary operational overhead when managed read replicas meet the requirement. Remember this distinction for the exam. For regional MySQL recovery, a cross-region read replica is a warmer and faster disaster recovery option than GeoRestore. Let us work through question number 8. Review the scenario carefully. A customer portal needs a DTU-based Azure SQL database with synchronous replicas and resilience to an availability zone outage. The architect must select the least expensive listed tier that matches those requirements. Which deployment option should be selected? Choose from the following options. Option A is Azure SQL Database Serverless. Option B is Azure SQL Database Premium. Option C is Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. Option D is Azure SQL Database Standard. The required response is Option B, Azure SQL Database Premium. Here is the technical justification. Premium is the listed DTU tier designed with multiple synchronous replicas and supports zone-redundant deployment natively. The remaining options are incorrect because A, serverless is a vCore compute option optimized for intermittent workloads, not the intended DTU high availability tier. C, managed instance is a different service and deployment model. D, standard does not match the intended premium replica architecture natively. Keep this examination point in mind. Match the purchasing model first, then select the lowest tier that satisfies the availability requirement. Question number 9. Now, an online reservation system will use one Azure SQL database in the DTU purchasing model. The design requires synchronous local replicas, no loss of committed transactions during failover, and zone-redundant placement. Very large database scale is not required. Which listed option provides the best cost-aligned fit? Options. Option A, Azure SQL Database Basic. Option B, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Option C, Azure SQL Database Premium. Option D, Azure SQL Database Serverless. The appropriate choice is Option C, Azure SQL Database Premium. The reasoning is as follows. Premium provides the required synchronous replica architecture and zone redundancy without selecting hyperscale when extreme database scale is unnecessary. A, Basic lacks the intended high availability and performance characteristics. B, Hyperscale can provide high availability but is intended for very large or rapidly scaling databases and is unnecessary here. D, Serverless optimizes intermittent compute usage and does not represent the required DTU premium replica architecture. Exam tip. Do not choose hyperscale unless scale characteristics require it. Use the least capable tier that fully meets high availability needs. The next item is question number 10. The focus now shifts to database migration. A legacy 50 GB SQL Server 2008 database must be moved to Azure SQL Managed Instance. The migration design should keep the source available for most of the migration and minimize cutover downtime. Which Microsoft service should orchestrate the migration? Option A, Azure Migrate Server Migration. Option B, Azure Database Migration Service. Option C, Azure Data Factory. Option D, SQL Server Migration Assistant. The required response is Option B, Azure Database Migration Service. The requirement is satisfied because Azure Database Migration Service is the managed migration service for SQL Server, including 2008 and later, to Azure SQL Managed Instance and supports minimal downtime migration workflows with controlled cutover. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Azure Migrate assesses and migrates servers, but is not the primary database replication and cutover service for SQL Managed Instance. C. Data Factory copies data, but is not the recommended end-to-end minimal downtime SQL MI migration orchestrator. D. SSMA is mainly used for heterogeneous schema conversion and assessment. Use Azure DMS for managed database migration orchestration. Use Azure Migrate primarily for server discovery, assessment, and rehosting. Question number 11. Requires careful analysis. Analyze the scenario before evaluating the choices. A tenant has a root management group. MG production contains subprod, while subtest is under a different management group. The ops group has virtual machine contributor on MG production. The platform group has contributor at the tenant root management group. Dana has contributor only on subprod. Alex is in ops, and Blair is in platform. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Review statement 1. Alex can create a virtual machine in a resource group in subprod. Review statement 2. Blair can assign the owner role to another group at subscription scope. Review statement 3. Dana can create a storage account in subtest. Statement 1. The answer is yes. Virtual machine contributor assigned at MG production is inherited by subprod and its resource groups. Statement 2. The answer is no. Contributor can manage resources but cannot create Azure or BAC role assignments. Statement 3. The answer is no. Dana's contributor assignment is limited to subprod and does not extend to a sibling subscription. A useful examination rule is this. Always evaluate principal, role definition, assignment scope, and inheritance separately. Now consider question number 12. Next, we enter the topic of identity governance. Review the situation. The Sales EU administrative unit contains the sales department's non-administrator users. 2 support staff members must receive delegated permissions limited to Sales EU. Match each staff responsibility to the least privileged Microsoft intro role assignment. The left side items are: left item 1. Provisioning lead who manages and updates user accounts within Sales EU. Left item 2. Support technician who only resets passwords for non-admin users in Sales EU. The second set contains: right option A, Helpdesk Administrator scope to Sales EU. Right option B, Helpdesk Administrator scope to the tenant. Right option C, User Administrator scope to Sales EU. Right option D, User Administrator scoped to the tenant. Here are the completed matches. The correct match for provisioning lead who manages and updates user accounts within Sales EU is User Administrator scope to Sales EU. The correct match for support technician who only resets passwords for non-admin users in Sales EU is Helpdesk Administrator scope to Sales EU. User Administrator provides broader user lifecycle management within the administrative unit. Helpdesk Administrator provides password reset capability for eligible users while keeping the scope limited to Sales EU. The key takeaway is use administrative unit scope to delegate directory administration without granting tenant-wide authority. Let us examine question number 13. Begin by examining the scenario. A single tenant app service application is registered in the Contoso tenant. A partner organization in another tenant needs governed B2B guest access with request approval, periodic review, and automatic expiration. Which Microsoft Intra capability should be recommended? Review each available choice. Choice A, Microsoft Intra Privileged Identity Management. Choice B, Microsoft Intra Entitlement Management Access Packages. Choice C, Pass-Through Authentication. Choice D, a Conditional Access Location Policy. In this case, select option B, Microsoft Intra Entitlement Management Access Packages. This is correct because entitlement management can package the application assignment for external users and apply governed B2B guest access, including request, approval, expiration, and access review processes. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. APIM governs privileged role activation rather than ordinary external application onboarding. C. Pass-through authentication validates on-premises passwords and does not onboard users from another tenant. D. Conditional access controls sign-in conditions, but does not create or govern partner access assignments. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use entitlement management for governed B2B access. Use multi-tenant app registration when the application itself must accept users from any tenant without guest onboarding. Question number 14. Next, we enter the topic of logging architecture. Consider this scenario. A cloud governance team needs a monthly inventory of successful Azure Resource Manager create and deployment operations in a subscription. Which Azure data source should the reporting solution use? Available choices. Option A, Azure Monitor Metrics. Option B, Azure Arc. Option C, Azure Activity Log. Option D, Azure Monitor Action Groups. The correct answer is option C, Azure Activity Log. The key reason is Azure Activity Log records subscription-level control plane operations, including successful resource and deployment right operations. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Metrics contain numeric time series measurements rather than a complete control plane deployment audit trail. B. Azure Arc extends Azure management to external resources and is not the deployment log. D. Action groups deliver notifications and do not store deployment events. Keep this examination point in mind. Use activity log for who, what, and when of Azure control plane changes. Question number 15. An enterprise subscription contains thousands of resources. Compliance reports must group resources by owning department and identify resources that lack the required department metadata. Which combination should the architect recommend? The options are Choice A, Administrative Units and Azure Lighthouse. Choice B, Application Groups and Quotas. Choice C, Azure Policy and Resource Tags. Choice D, Resource Groups and Role Assignments. The best answer is option C, Azure Policy and Resource Tags. Here is the technical justification. Tags provide department metadata for grouping and reporting, while Azure Policy can require, inherit, or audit the presence and values of those tags. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Administrative Units scope Microsoft intra-objects, and Lighthouse supports cross-tenant management. B. Application Groups and Quotas do not provide enterprise resource classification and compliance enforcement. D. Resource Groups are lifecycle containers, and Role Assignments control access. Neither enforces department metadata across the estate. Exam tip. Tags classify resources. Azure Policy enforces the classification standard. The next key item is question number 16. This question moves us into log routing. This scenario establishes the key requirement. A finance team must create a recurring monthly report of successful resource deployments and retain the underlying control plane records beyond the default activity log retention period. Which component should be included in the architecture? Focus on the distinction between these options. Option A, Azure Advisor. Option B, Azure Arc. Option C, a log analytics workspace. Option D, Azure Monitor Metrics. In this case, select option C, a log analytics workspace. The reasoning is as follows. A diagnostic setting can route subscription activity log data to log analytics, where KQL queries and scheduled reporting can analyze deployments and retain records longer than the default period. The remaining options are incorrect because A. Advisor provides optimization recommendations, not a control plane audit dataset. B. Arc enables Azure management for external resources and does not provide deployment reporting. D. Metrics are time series values and do not contain the required deployment event details. Route activity log to log analytics when you need long retention, KQL correlation, or scheduled reporting. Apply precise reasoning to question number 17. Identify the decisive requirement in this scenario. An app service application currently accepts users only from its home Microsoft intratenant. The application must allow work or school accounts from a second organization to sign in directly through their own tenant. What should be changed? Evaluate each option against the stated requirement. Consider option A. Enable Microsoft Intra-Identity Protection. Consider option B. Change supported account types to accounts in any organizational directory and use a multi-tenant authority. Consider option C. Assign the partner users through PIM. Consider option D. Create a conditional access policy. The appropriate choice is option B. Change supported account types to accounts in any organizational directory and use a multi-tenant authority. The requirement is satisfied because a multi-tenant app registration allows organizational accounts from other Microsoft intra-tenants to authenticate, and the sign-in authority must support multiple tenants. A. Identity protection detects and remediates identity risk, but does not change application tenancy. CPIM activates privileged roles and does not make an application multi-tenant. D. Conditional access evaluates sign-ins after the application accepts the identity. It does not change the sign-in audience. A useful examination rule is this. Supported account types controls who can authenticate. Conditional access controls conditions after authentication is possible. Question number 18 highlights an important distinction. Focus on the following situation. A payment system requires an Azure SQL database vCore deployment with multiple synchronous replicas, low-latency local storage, and zone-redundant placement. Failover must not lose committed transactions. Which service tier should be selected? The relevant choices are as follows. Now examine choice A, Azure SQL Database Basic. Now examine choice B, Azure SQL Database Serverless. Now examine choice C, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. Now examine choice D, Azure SQL Database Business Critical. The required response is option D, Azure SQL Database Business Critical. Business Critical uses a quorum-based architecture with multiple synchronous replicas and local SSD storage, and it supports zone-redundant deployment natively. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Basic does not provide the required high-availability architecture. B. Serverless is a compute option for intermittent workloads and is not the required service tier. C. Managed Instance General Purpose uses remote storage and changes the deployment model. The key takeaway is Business Critical is the vCore tier for low-latency storage and multiple synchronous replicas. The next item is question number 19. We are moving to messaging architecture. Review the situation. A retail workflow contains independently scaled order, payment, stock, and shipping services. The services must exchange XML work messages asynchronously by using a simple, durable Azure queue that scales massively without requiring advanced brokering. Which service should be selected? Review the options. Choice A, Azure Blob Storage. Choice B, Azure Service Fabric. Choice C, Azure Queue Storage. Choice D, Azure Data Lake Storage. The best answer is option C, Azure Queue Storage. This is correct because Azure Queue Storage provides simple, durable asynchronous queues for decoupling application components without the overhead of advanced message brokering. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Blob storage is object storage and lacks queue delivery semantics. B. Service Fabric is an application platform, not a managed message queue. D. Data Lake Storage is optimized for analytical files, not transactional work queues. Remember this distinction for the exam. Choose queue storage for simple, large-scale application work queues when advanced broker features are not required. Let us focus on question number 20. The central scenario is as follows. A claims platform has separate validation, billing, settlement, and notification services. The services need a managed Azure message broker to exchange XML commands asynchronously and support advanced pub sub patterns. Which service should be included? The relevant choices are as follows. Option A, Azure Notification Hubs. Option B, Azure Blob Storage. Option C, Azure Service Fabric. Option D, Azure Service Bus. The correct answer is option D, Azure Service Bus. The key reason is Azure Service Bus is a managed enterprise message broker that provides durable queues and topics, pub sub, for asynchronous communication between distributed services. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Notification hubs is for device push notifications. B. Blob storage stores objects and does not provide broker semantics. C. Service Fabric hosts distributed applications but is not the managed messaging service requested. Keep this examination point in mind. Service bus is the enterprise broker required when advanced message routing, order delivery, or pub sub capabilities are needed. Proceed to question number 21. Scenario. A fraud detection application requires a vCore-based Azure SQL database with zone-redundant synchronous replicas and no loss of committed transactions during automatic failover. Which listed deployment option should be used? Option A. Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Option B. Azure SQL Database Basic. Option C. Azure SQL Database Business Critical. Option D. Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. The appropriate choice is option C, Azure SQL Database Business Critical. Here is the technical justification. Business Critical provides multiple synchronous replicas and supports zone redundancy for high availability with zero data loss for committed transactions during local failover. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Hyperscale is optimized for very large databases and is unnecessary without a scale requirement. B. Basic does not meet the high availability requirement. D. Managed Instance General Purpose is a different service model and does not provide the intended local replica architecture. Exam tip. Select Business Critical for the strongest local Azure SQL database high availability architecture when hyperscale capacity is not required. We will now analyze question number 22. The focus now shifts to log routing. Consider the following scenario. A platform team must produce a monthly report of successful ARM deployments and correlate each deployment with other operational logs. Which service should be used as the central query store? Compare the following options. Option A is Application Insights. Option B is Azure Monitor Action Groups. Option C is Azure Log Analytics. Option D is Azure Arc. In this case, select option C, Azure Log Analytics. The reasoning is as follows. Routing activity log records to log analytics enables KQL queries, correlation with other operational logs, and scheduled reports. The remaining options are incorrect because A. Application Insights focuses on application performance telemetry. B. Action groups deliver alert notifications and do not store queryable records. D. Azure Arc extends Azure management but is not a centralized log analytics store. Activity log is the source. Log analytics is the query and retention platform for richer reporting. Now consider question number 23. Consider this scenario. A manufacturing application has independent procurement, accounting, warehouse, and delivery components. The components must post XML work items to a simple, durable asynchronous queue that does not require message ordering guarantees. Which Azure service should be recommended? Available choices. Choice A, Azure Traffic Manager. Choice B, Azure Queue Storage. Choice C, Azure Data Lake Storage. Choice D, Azure Application Gateway. The required response is option B, Azure Queue Storage. The requirement is satisfied because Azure Queue Storage provides a simple, durable asynchronous queue required to decouple the components without unnecessary broker features. A. Traffic Manager performs DNS-based traffic routing. C. Data Lake Storage stores analytical data and does not provide work queue semantics. D. Application Gateway routes web traffic and does not broker messages. A useful examination rule is this. Routing services move network requests. Queue services decouple application work. Choose queue storage for simple point-to-point queues. Question number 24 highlights an important distinction. The central scenario is as follows. A logistics solution separates booking, invoicing, capacity, and dispatch processing. Each service must asynchronously receive XML work records from a simple, durable queue that does not require advanced pub sub capabilities. Which Azure service is the appropriate component? Focus on the distinction between these options. Now examine choice A, Azure Application Gateway. Now examine choice B, Azure Service Fabric. Now examine choice C, Azure Queue Storage. Now examine choice D, Azure Traffic Manager. The best answer is option C, Azure Queue Storage. Azure Queue Storage is the only listed managed queue and supports simple, durable asynchronous communication between application components without requiring advanced pub sub features. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Application Gateway is a regional Layer 7 load balancer. B. Service Fabric is a distributed application platform, not a queue service. D. Traffic Manager is DNS-based global routing. The key takeaway is use messaging services for asynchronous work transfer, not load balancers or compute platforms. Now consider question number 25. This question moves us into Azure SQL design. A line of business application requires a single DTU-based Azure SQL database with synchronous high availability replicas across availability zones. Instance-level SQL server compatibility is not required. Which listed deployment is the best cost-aligned option? The options are: Option A, Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical. Option B, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Option C, Azure SQL Database Premium. Option D, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. The correct answer is option C, Azure SQL Database Premium. This is correct because Premium is the Azure SQL Database DTU tier that matches the required synchronous replica and zone-redundant architecture natively without paying for managed instance compatibility or hyperscale capacity. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Managed Instance Business Critical adds instance-level compatibility and a different cost model that are not required. B. Hyperscale is unnecessary without extreme database growth or size. D. Managed Instance General Purpose changes the service model and does not match the intended premium local replica design. Remember this distinction for the exam. Avoid paying for managed instance compatibility or hyperscale capacity when a premium single database meets the design. Question number 26. Consider this scenario. One operations team will centrally manage network insights, workspace-based application insights, Microsoft Sentinel, and VM insights. There are no data residency, tenant separation, or access separation requirements. What is the minimum number of log analytics workspaces required? Review the options. Option A, 4. Option B, 2. Option C, 1. Option D, 3. In this case, select option C, 1. The key reason is a single log analytics workspace can receive operational and security data for these services when one team owns the data and no isolation requirement exists. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Separate workspaces for every feature are not mandatory. B. 2 workspaces may be chosen for security isolation or cost design, but those requirements are absent. D. 3 workspaces add unnecessary management overhead. Keep this examination point in mind. Log Analytics workspace count is driven by tenancy, region, retention, access, and ownership boundaries, not by the number of monitoring features. Review question number 27. Carefully. Let us first review the situation. An Ubuntu application on Azure Virtual Machines calls a third-party email API. The provider authenticates requests with an API key. The design must avoid credentials in code and minimize identity administration. Complete the key vault design. Review statement 1. Store the provider credential as a key vault the blank. The available choices are 1. Certificate, key, or secret. Review statement 2. Let the application access key vault by using the blank. The available choices are 2. An API token, a managed identity, or a manually maintained service principal secret. Statement 1 should be completed with secret. API keys are opaque credential values and should be stored as key vault secrets. Statement 2 should be completed with a managed identity. A managed identity is managed by Azure and avoids storing another application credential. Exam tip. Key vault keys perform cryptographic operations. API keys and connection strings are normally stored as secrets. Let us focus on question number 28. Next, we enter the topic of authorization design. Focus on the following situation. A protected API and a daemon client have separate Microsoft intra-app registrations. The API exposes an application role named writer. Access tokens requested by the daemon must include writer in the role's claim. Match each app registration to the blade used for its part of the configuration. Begin with the following left side entries. Left side entry 1. Protected API app registration. Left side entry 2. Daemon client app registration. Choose matches from the following right side entries. Right side entry A. API permissions. Right side entry B. App roles. Right side entry C. Token configuration. Use the following matching result. Match protected API app registration with app roles. Match daemon client app registration with API permissions. Here is the technical justification. Define writer on the protected API under app roles. Then add and grant that application permission to the daemon client under API permissions so issued access tokens contain the authorized roles claim. App roles are defined on the resource API and assigned or consented to the calling client. Let us examine question number 29. Review the scenario carefully. A multi-tier service will run on virtual machines in 2 Azure regions. Each region uses multiple availability zones. CPU demand spikes twice each weekday, while the workload is light for most of the day and should accumulate burst capacity. Complete the infrastructure recommendation. For the first statement, deploy at least the blank virtual networks. Choose between 1, 2, or 4. For the second statement, use the blank virtual machine family. Choose between 2, A series, B series, D series, or M series. For statement 1, select 2. An Azure virtual network is regional and spans the availability zones in its region, so 2 regions require at least 2 VNets. For statement 2, select B series. B series virtual machines are burstable and accumulate CPU credits during low utilization for later bursts. A useful examination rule is this. Availability zones do not require separate VNets, but regions do. B series is designed for credit-based burst workloads. Proceed to question number 30. The focus now shifts to data analytics design. Scenario. A Cosmos DB for NoSQL container receives continuous operational updates. Analysts must query the data daily from Azure Synapse Analytics without consuming request units or degrading the transactional workload. Which integration should be recommended? Choice A. Azure Cosmos DB change feed with custom ingestion code. Choice B. Azure Data Factory copy activities. Choice C. Azure Synapse Link for Azure Cosmos DB. Choice D. Polybase bulk loading. The appropriate choice is option C. Azure Synapse Link for Azure Cosmos DB. The reasoning is as follows. Azure Synapse Link exposes the Cosmos DB analytical store for near real-time analytics without running analytical queries against the transactional store. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Change feed requires a custom pipeline and still adds operational complexity. B. Scheduled copies introduce movement, latency, and pipeline management. D. Polybase is not the native 0ETL integration for Cosmos DB operational data. The key takeaway is use Synapse Link when analytics must be isolated from Cosmos DB transactional request units. The next item is question number 31. Review the situation. An on-premises SQL Server instance hosts 50 databases. The organization accepts an offline migration to Azure SQL Managed Instance and wants a managed service that minimizes per database administration. Which migration component should be used? Review the options. Option A, Data Migration Assistant. Option B, Azure Database Migration Service. Option C, SQL Server Migration Assistant. Option D, Azure Migrate Server Migration. The best answer is option B, Azure Database Migration Service. The requirement is satisfied because Azure Database Migration Service orchestrates database migrations to Azure SQL Managed Instance and supports migrating databases at scale with centralized monitoring. The remaining options are incorrect because A. DMA assesses compatibility but is not the migration orchestration service. C. SSMA is primarily for converting non-SQL server database schemas and data. D. Azure migrates server migration rehosts servers rather than performing a past database migration. Remember this distinction for the exam. Use assessment tools to evaluate compatibility and DMS to execute managed database migrations. Question number 32. We are moving to hybrid identity. Background. Northwind Engineering operates a production Active Directory forest for employees and a separate research forest with no trust. Research identities and workloads must remain on-premises. Current environment. Production users will adopt Microsoft 365 and Azure. Administrators must sign in to Azure by using their production UPNs. Production domain controllers remain available in each office, and directory synchronization uses the production forest. Business requirements. Keep research operations isolated on-premises and minimize identity infrastructure. All Azure administrative access must require multi-factor authentication. Technical requirements. Create only the cloud identity boundaries and conditional access controls required for production users. The research forest must not synchronize to the cloud. Which combination provides the minimum design? Choice A. 1 Microsoft intratenant and 1 conditional access policy. Choice B. 1 Microsoft intratenant and 2 conditional access policies. Choice C. 2 Microsoft intratenants and 1 conditional access policy. Choice D. 2 Microsoft intratenants and 2 conditional access policies. The required response is option A. 1 Microsoft intratenant and 1 conditional access policy. Only the production forest needs a cloud identity boundary, so 1 tenant is sufficient. 1 conditional access policy can target Azure administrative roles or the Azure management application and require MFA. B. A second policy is unnecessary for the stated single MFA requirement. C. The research forest remains entirely on-premises and does not require its own tenant. D. Neither an additional tenant nor an additional policy is required. Keep this examination point in mind. Create tenants for genuine identity isolation boundaries. Use 1 conditional access policy when 1 consistent MFA control covers all Azure administrators. The next item is question number 33. A central operations team needs a monthly dashboard of successful Azure resource deployments and must retain the records for trend analysis. Which service should receive exported subscription activity log data? Available choices. Choice A. Azure Monitor Metrics. Choice B. Application Insights. Choice C. Azure Log Analytics. Choice D. Azure Arc. The correct answer is option C, Azure Log Analytics. This is correct because Log Analytics stores exported activity log records, supports KQL queries, and enables dashboards and longer retention. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Metrics do not contain complete control plane deployment events. B. Application Insights is for application telemetry. D. Azure Arc is a management plane for external resources, not a deployment log store. Exam tip. Export activity log to Log Analytics for durable, queryable governance reporting. Now consider question number 34. Review the situation. A latency-sensitive transaction system needs a vCore-based Azure SQL database with local SSD storage, multiple synchronous replicas, and zone-redundant high availability. Extreme database size is not a requirement. Which option should be recommended? The options are: Option A, Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical. Option B, Azure SQL Database Standard. Option C, Azure SQL Database Business Critical. Option D, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. In this case, select Option C, Azure SQL Database Business Critical. The key reason is Azure SQL Database Business Critical supplies the local SSD and synchronous replica architecture and can be deployed zone redundantly, for V core-based tier solutions. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Managed instance adds instance-level compatibility that is not required. B. Standard does not provide the intended business-critical architecture natively. D. Hyperscale is optimized for very large databases and uses a different storage architecture. Choose business-critical for low-latency OLTP and synchronous local replicas. Choose hyperscale for exceptional scale requirements. Let us work through question number 35. Begin by examining the scenario. A wholesale platform separates purchase, billing, inventory, and transport processing. XML job records must be placed on a simple, durable asynchronous Azure queue without need for topics or subscriptions. Which service should be selected? Choose from the following options. Choice A, Azure Notification Hubs. Choice B, Azure Queue Storage. Choice C, Azure Service Fabric. Choice D, Azure Traffic Manager. The best answer is option B, Azure Queue Storage. Here is the technical justification. Azure Queue Storage provides the simple, durable asynchronous queue needed by the independent processing components when advanced broker features are unnecessary. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Notification Hubs is for push notifications. C. Service Fabric hosts applications but is not a managed queue. D. Traffic Manager performs DNS-based routing. A useful examination rule is this. A durable work queue decouples processing stages. Select queue storage over service bus when pub sub and strict ordering are explicitly not needed. Proceed to question number 36. Consider this scenario. A subscription commerce application uses separate ordering, invoicing, payment, and fulfillment services. The architect needs a managed message broker for asynchronous XML commands that supports topics and subscriptions. Which Azure service should be included? Review the options. Option A, Azure Application Gateway. Option B, Azure Service Bus. Option C, Azure Blob Storage. Option D, Azure Notification Hubs. The appropriate choice is option B, Azure Service Bus. The reasoning is as follows. Azure Service Bus supplies durable queues and topics for brokered asynchronous communication among distributed services that require pub submodels. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Application Gateway routes HTTP traffic and does not broker messages. C. Blob storage is object storage. D. Notification Hubs targets push notifications to devices. The key takeaway is use Service Bus for brokered enterprise messaging with topics and subscriptions. Use queue storage for simpler point-to-point queues. Let us examine question number 37. Let us first review the situation. Auditors require a report of all successful Azure Resource Manager deployment operations performed during the previous month. Which Azure source contains the required control plane events? Now examine the possible answers. Option A is Azure Advisor. Option B is Azure Activity Log. Option C is Azure Analysis Services. Option D is Application Insights. The correct answer is option B, Azure Activity Log. The requirement is satisfied because Azure Activity Log records subscription-level administrative operations, including resource deployments and other write actions. The remaining options are incorrect because A. Advisor produces optimization recommendations. C. Analysis Services is an analytical modeling service. D. Application Insights captures application performance telemetry rather than the subscription control plane. Remember this distinction for the exam. Resource creation, update, and deletion events belong to the Azure Activity Log. Let us work through question number 38. The focus now shifts to messaging architecture. Begin by examining the scenario. An insurance workflow contains policy, premium, claims, and correspondence services. The services must exchange XML commands through a managed asynchronous broker that supports advanced routing rules. Which service should be recommended? Review each available choice. Choice A, Azure Data Lake Storage. Choice B, Azure Notification Hubs. Choice C, Azure Service Bus. Choice D, Azure Application Gateway. The required response is option C, Azure Service Bus. Azure Service Bus is the managed enterprise broker that provides advanced routing capabilities for durable asynchronous application messaging. A. Data lake storage is an analytical file store. B. Notification hubs sends mobile push notifications. D. Application gateway load balances and protects web traffic. Keep this examination point in mind. Message brokers decouple services. Select Service Bus when advanced message routing rules are required. Question number 39. Scenario. A travel platform has booking, payment, availability, and ticketing services. Each service must publish or consume XML work messages asynchronously through a managed Azure message broker. Which component should be selected? The options are: Choice A, Azure Notification Hubs. Choice B, Azure Traffic Manager. Choice C, Azure Data Lake Storage. Choice D, Azure Service Bus. The appropriate choice is option D, Azure Service Bus. This is correct because Azure Service Bus provides the required publish/subscribe brokered queue and topic messaging for distributed application services. The alternatives can be eliminated because A. Notification hubs is for mobile push delivery. B. Traffic Manager is DNS-based global routing. C. Data Lake Storage is not a transactional message broker. Exam tip. Use Service Bus for durable brokered pub/sub messages and Azure Queue Storage for simple queue semantics. Evaluate question number 40. Against every requirement. Pay close attention to every stated constraint. A repair management system separates intake, pricing, parts, and dispatch services. The services need a simple, durable asynchronous queue for XML work items without advanced message routing. Which Azure service should the architect recommend? Eliminate any option that fails a requirement. Next, option A, Azure Blob Storage. Next, option B, Azure Queue Storage. Next, option C, Azure Data Lake Storage. Next, option D, Azure Application Gateway. In this case, select option B, Azure Queue Storage. The key reason is Azure Queue Storage provides simple, durable message queues for decoupling the services and carrying the XML work items without unnecessary advanced routing overhead. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. Blob storage stores objects and has no queue delivery model. C. Data lake storage is intended for analytical files. D. Application gateway is a web traffic gateway. For simple asynchronous point-to-point work distribution, choose queue storage rather than Service Bus. We will now analyze question number 41. Consider the following scenario. A claims processing company is selecting a managed relational database for a new application. The application does not require SQL Server instance-level features. The database must use synchronous replicas across availability zones so that a zone failure causes no committed data loss. Cost must be lower than an instance-based deployment. Which deployment should the architect recommend? Review each available choice. Choice A, Azure SQL Database Standard. Choice B, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. Choice C, Zone Redundant Azure SQL Database Premium. Choice D, Zone Redundant Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical. The best answer is option C, Zone Redundant Azure SQL Database Premium. Here is the technical justification. Premium supports zone-redundant synchronous replicas for Azure SQL Database. It protects against a zone outage without requiring the higher cost and instance compatibility of Managed Instance Business Critical. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. Standard does not support zone redundancy natively in the same multi-sync replica architecture as Premium. B. Managed Instance General Purpose does not provide the required synchronous zone-redundant replica architecture natively. D. Managed Instance Business Critical can meet the availability requirement, but adds unnecessary instance-level capability and cost. A useful examination rule is this. Choose the least expensive SQL deployment that satisfies zone redundancy and compatibility requirements. Review question number 42. Carefully. This question moves us into unstructured storage. Review the scenario carefully. A research organization will store governed data assets in an Azure storage account. Data must support worm retention, public anonymous access must be disabled, and authorization must include directory and file-level ACLs based on Microsoft Azure identities. Which storage capability should be used? Choose from the following options. Option A is Azure Files. Option B is Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. Option C is Azure NetApp Files. Option D is Azure Blob Storage without hierarchical namespace. The correct answer is Option B, Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. The reasoning is as follows. Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2 adds a hierarchical namespace and POSIX-style ACLs to blob storage while supporting intra-authorization, disabled anonymous access, and immutable blob policies. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Azure Files supports file permissions, but is not the intended blob-based data lake service with hierarchical namespace, ACLs, and immutable blob governance. C. Azure NetApp Files is a separate managed file service and is not an Azure storage account capability. D. Standard blob storage supports immutability, but does not provide hierarchical namespace, ACLs. The key takeaway is use Data Lake Storage Generation 2 when object storage also requires directory semantics and fine-grained ACLs. Apply precise reasoning to question number 43. Pay close attention to every stated constraint. A telemetry platform will ingest petabytes of structured and unstructured text. Analysts need low-latency interactive exploration, and the cluster must support manual capacity changes, service-managed autoscale, and custom autoscale logic. Curated results will later be archived in Data Lake Storage Generation 2. Complete the architecture recommendation. The first statement reads, the interactive analytics store should be the blank. The options for this statement are 1. Azure Data Explorer, Log Analytics, or Azure Synapse, Serverless SQL. The second statement reads, the native query language should be the blank. The options for this statement are 2. Custo Query Language, KQL, Transact SQL, or USQL. The correct value for statement 1 is Azure Data Explorer. Azure Data Explorer provides the required interactive petabyte-scale analytics and scaling models. The correct value for statement 2 is Custo Query Language, KQL. KQL is the native language for querying Azure Data Explorer. Remember this distinction for the exam. Pair Azure Data Explorer with KQL for interactive analysis of massive log and telemetry datasets. Proceed to question number 44. Review the situation. A startup needs one relational database for an intermittently used application. Compute must scale automatically. Billing must be based on compute consumed per second, and the database must be able to pause during inactivity to minimize cost. Select the Azure SQL product and service tier. Choose the correct entry for every drop-down field. Statement 1. The Azure SQL product should be the blank. The available choices are 1. A single Azure SQL database, an Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool, or Azure SQL Managed Instance. Statement 2. The service tier should be the blank. The available choices are 2. General purpose, business critical, or hyperscale. For statement 1, select a single Azure SQL database. Serverless is a compute option for individual databases rather than managed instance or an elastic pool. For statement 2, select general purpose. General purpose supports autopause, which uniquely satisfies the inactivity requirement. Keep this examination point in mind. Serverless is selected at the single database level. Use autopause requirements to uniquely distinguish general purpose serverless logic. Let us examine question number 45. Let us first review the situation. A managed SQL instance stores employee contact numbers and government identifiers. Support agents may view only the final 4 digits of each phone number. Platform and database administrators must not be able to view plaintext government identifiers. Select the protection feature for each column. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate value. The first statement reads, phone number query results should use the blank. Choose between 1. Dynamic data masking, always encrypted, or transparent data encryption. The second statement reads, Government identifiers should use the blank. Choose between two: always encrypted, dynamic data masking, or transparent data encryption. Statement 1 should be completed with dynamic data masking. Dynamic data masking is designed to obscure portions of return values for users without unmasked permission. Statement 2 should be completed with always encrypted. Always encrypted protects selected sensitive columns from administrators who do not possess the client-side keys. Exam tip: masking changes query presentation. Always encrypted protects column plaintext from the database engine. You have completed part 1 of the AZ-305 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.